Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your suffocating host, Abraham.
And I am your delirious host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast. We talk about the things that people do and sometimes how we diagnose what those things are, and sometimes when we just pretend that they do things that they don't actually do.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes animals and like politics and all kinds of other things. But that's what we're doing. If you found us for the first time, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Yeah, stoked you're here. And today is, I think, going to be pretty interesting because it's kind of that thing that comes up where, you know, it's almost like everybody is so cautious of this thing or worried about this thing, but it never happens. It's like a chupacabra almost.
Yeah. I mean, they say that it happens like a chupacabra, but it doesn't.
Doesn't happen.
It doesn't seem to happen that way.
Nope.
And by today, you mean August 2nd, which is National Ice Cream Sandwich Day.
Yes. What a great day. It's also National Coloring Book Day. So if you would like to revert back to your childhood, today is the day to do it.
Yeah. This is Take a Penny, Leave a Penny Day. And not more than that, Steve.
Yeah. We know. We know what you're doing. It's also International Clown Week, so I guess if you are not afraid of clowns, that's good.
If you like counting clowns coming out of cars, though, it's International Mathematicians Week. So
yeah, that's true. But if you don't like any of that, that seems too complicated. This week is also Simplify Your Life Week.
Indeed. For those of you for whom you'd like to celebrate, this is also World Breastfeeding Week. Breastfeeding the world.
Good for y'all. I like that. It's also Back to School Month. So at least in the United States, that's what we're sending everybody back to school. This year, my daughter's senior year, so that's a thing.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And when we started, that's crazy.
I know.
Passage of time. All right. It is also American Adventures Month. I don't really know what that means, but that's the month that we're in, I guess.
Yeah. Go see some stuff, I guess. Maybe avoid some of the deserts right now because they're very hot.
Very hot.
It's also Boomers Making a Difference Month. So that's a change of pace.
Boomers learning Zoom.
Yeah, boomers on Zoomers.
All right. So today we have an interesting and politically loaded topic, I think, politically charged. Maybe if you like what you hear today and you'd like to support the show, you can leave us a rating and review. You can subscribe so you get all our episodes. You can join us on Patreon. You can plant a tree and name that tree Why We Do What We Do. And I'll talk more about the ways you can support us at the end of this discussion. But as we're getting into this, it's important to acknowledge, I want to let everyone out there know, trigger warning, this discussion is going to contain topics such as brutal murders, torture, sexual violence, injustice, racism, and sexism. Now, I think we try and handle those as gently as we can. There's also don't want to sugarcoat or whitewash things and sort of say it as it is. So if you have trouble listening to those things, you might want to sit this one out, but we'll do our best to be sensitive in our discussion of this.
I think we can't really talk about this thing without those things, and you'll see kind of what we mean as we go. But yeah, if those things are upsetting for you, it's okay to turn it off and go to the next episode.
So let's start with a story that I think illuminates the topic at hand. And this begins on December 23rd, 2020 in Antioch, California. For those of you who are not up on your United States geography, or maybe you're not on your California geography, and possibly not on your Northern California geography, because this seems like a fairly small, this is still in the Bay Area, so kind of over by San Francisco on the west coast of the United States. So this December 23rd, 2020 in Antioch, California, Angelo Quinto, a 30-year-old Filipino veteran, he was having a mental crisis. And during this time, he reportedly threatened his family. He appeared aggressive. They were concerned that he might hurt himself or them or someone else. And he appeared just sort of angry. And so to try and deal with this, his mother, Cassandra Quinto Collins, she sort of put him in a bear hug to just sort of keep him restrained and together. And in fear, while this is going on, his sister Bella called the police to also come. And obviously, like, there's a whole discussion here about sort of emergency procedures, but she thought, I need to call the police because we're afraid that there's danger here. And so she did that while they were sort of trying to hold him in a pseudo restraint, if you will, that was sort of a upright bear hug.
Right. So when the police arrived, they pulled Angelo from his mother's arms, placed him in handcuffs, and laid him prone, face down, on the ground, and kneeled on his shoulders and back for 5 minutes, during which time Angelo begged not to be killed.
So as they're kneeling on him, eventually he became unresponsive. The paramedics arrived and they noted that there was blood on his face and also blood on the ground where his face had been pressed, and that his face was purplish in color. So they immediately begin life-saving operations. Angelo is taken to the hospital, and at the hospital, he never regained consciousness and was then pronounced dead 3 days later.
Yeah, it's awful. The family understandably felt that the police used excessive force that resulted in the unnecessary death of their brother and son. And after an investigation into his death, a forensic pathologist testified that the death was due to, quote, excited delirium, which they categorize as natural causes. So the DA, Deanna Beckton, used this to justify the decision against pressing charges against the officers involved in Quinto's death.
In response to this, at a press briefing, there's a quote here. It goes, quote, "What you did last Friday feels like Angelo was being killed in front of me again." This is Angelo's mother. Again, this is Cassandra Quinto Collins. She was outside a state building in Oakland after hearing that there would be no further investigation into their son's death.
It's awful. So this begs the question of what the is excited delirium? I mean, that's really what we're trying to answer here. This apparent psychological condition that's so severe that it leads to death suddenly. We had to know. So that's what this episode is really all about. We're going to dive into this concept of excited delirium because if it's a natural cause, then we should all be really worried that it's going to come out of nowhere. But what we might find is it's not exactly natural.
Yeah, just as you said, this is portrayed as a psychological condition that is also sort of vaguely linked to medical condition, but it seems to be a at least partially, if not significantly, psychological condition. As far as we can tell, the term appears to have been coined in the early 80s, specifically 1981 and 1985 in publications by Dr. Charles Wheatley and Dr. David Fishbane. And they were describing the behaviors of people who were intoxicated with high levels of cocaine. And specifically, these are people such as drug mules who are smuggling cocaine intracorporeally, where the container of cocaine broke open inside of that person. Like they were smuggling it, right? Uh-huh. And then because it broke open inside of them, they received massive doses of cocaine, which led to what they described as delirium and also death.
Dr. Wheatley and Dr. Fishbane sound like villains.
Those are kind of villainous names, aren't they?
Like Dr. Fishbane sounds like 100% that person's a villain. Like that person is definitely working on super strength sharks. Actually, that doctor is probably the reason why we have cocaine sharks in Florida now.
And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and trigger my own vocabulary on myself for a word that I used in there, which was intracorporeally.
Yes, that's such a good word because I think of corporeal as being ghost related.
Yeah, and that's specifically incorporeal, which basically means not having a body. So corporeal refers to a body, and therefore intracorporeal means inside the body. So basically intracorporeally, the way that I used it, meant contained inside someone's physical body, which maybe people have heard the joke about pooping a balloon. The idea being that people will consume or otherwise hide drugs in their system to carry across borders so that they don't have to try and hide it in their clothes or in their luggage or something like that, where it could be easily found by drug dogs or just basic search and seizure procedures.
Yep.
So that's what that means.
Said another way, people got drugs in their butt.
Yeah, basically. And if the container that held those drugs popped, then they might die of an overdose. And before they die, might exhibit some symptoms of delirium. So let's continue to sort of talk about Wheatley and Fishbane and their descriptions of excited delirium.
These villains. All right. So Wheatley extended his theory to explain the death of 12 black women in Florida who were presumably sex workers after they had consumed small amounts of cocaine. He hypothesized that the cocaine made men psychotic because, quote, cocaine in combination with certain blood types, which was more common in black folks, is lethal. That was Wheatley's argument. So clearly a villain.
Yeah. And this is speculation at best. And that's really putting it much more nicely than it deserves. Eventually, a 14-year-old girl died in similar circumstances without cocaine in her system. And so long story short about this whole situation here, this is a 2-year period from about 1986 to 1988, and this last girl, this 14-year-old, died in similar circumstances, did not have cocaine in her system. And so they re-looked at this case in a different way, and that 14-year-old, as well as those other 12 girls, even though they had been sex workers, because he had suspected that the cocaine was the cause of their death, they had not looked at this as homicide. And then when this 14-year-old died in similar circumstances, they did look at it a homicide, and they discovered that she had been murdered And the other 12 girls had also been murdered by strangulation from a serial killer that they then found, but they, of course, were not looking for when they were ruling these as natural cause deaths.
Yes, so it's an unfortunate circumstance that you will find that many police departments that experience a lot of like missing persons related to sex workers or anything like that will write that off as, oh, well, they're just transient, and tend to write a lot of sex workers off
just on drugs.
Yeah, or they're just on drugs. And so they'll write a lot of folks that are sex workers off as just kind of like disposable.
Yeah.
So you'll end up with a lot of Jane Does and a lot of kind of cold cases as a result of just the fact that somebody's labeled a sex worker, which is completely unfair and unfortunate.
And I think that we talked about sex workers in a previous episode, just all about sex work.
We did talk about that.
Yeah, so you can go back, and I think that we covered this in that, or at least part of that, the fact that there's so few protections for those people because of their legal status. So
yes,
a little bit more information in that episode.
Yeah. Even then, even after the serial killer situation was found, Wheatley insisted that because they had cocaine in their systems, they became overly stimulated during sex, and that resulted in delirium and death. Presumably, they got so worked up while engaging in vigorous sex while they had cocaine in their system that they sort of spontaneously asphyxiated, I guess. And he continued to promote this idea, even claiming that, quote, 70% of people dying of coke-induced delirium are black males, even though most users are white. Why? It may be genetic, end quote. Ugh. God, that's so frustrating.
Yeah, so you can really see the racism and misogyny was baked right into this idea at its very foundation. The beginning place of this is the idea that black people basically belong to a different species that is more susceptible to these kind of medical conditions than other people. And it's something to do with their genes, he supposes, even though there is no evidence for that whatsoever. And black people are literally just people who happen to have more melanin in their skin.
Right. It's an absurd theory. It's so frustrating. I'm sure that for folks listening, this is not a surprise. And I think that's an unfortunate thing too. Like it's unfortunate this is a theory that's come up and that's kind of like prevailed for some time, but it's also not a surprise that something like this would come up from somebody in the scientific community who has like a particular agenda, you know?
Very much so, and we'll definitely get into that. And I do want to clarify really quick, as I say that they're just people. What I'm trying to say here is that the idea of race is a construct, and so trying to overlay this concept of blackness on top of someone, and that being being linked to then different genetic susceptibilities to things like cocaine overdose or delirium doesn't make any sense because race is just this construct that does not explain that sort of thing.
Right, exactly.
So making sure that's clear.
Right. So inspired by this line of reasoning, a defense expert for a company that manufactured police weapons wrote a book with his wife entitled, quote, Excited Delirium Syndrome, which they promoted by freely distributing at medical examiner and police chief conferences. So they would show up at these different conferences and promote this book.
Yeah.
And presumably this is when the idea really took hold. So you basically have this thing that a scientist has made up. You promote it to a bunch of people who are looking for a reason. And now we have Excited Delirium as like a thing that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and presumably at the time they were doing this, there was like 500 registered forensic pathologists or something like that, and whoever was like the people going to these conferences, these medical examiners and whatnot, and they printed like 1,000 or 1,500 books so that they'd make sure they had plenty on hand, so that they could just hand them out freely to these people, so that they had this idea then as something to include in their sort of toolbox. And so at this point, the description of excited delirium was fairly consistently described in a few ways. There's a lot of words that they use. They describe it as, quote, bizarre and or aggressive behavior, shouting, paranoia, violence toward others, unexpected physical strength, and hypothermia, I mean, hot, end quote. And then another description here is, quote, tolerance to pain, constant or near constant physical activity, failing to respond to police presence. Yeah, that's a medical condition. Superhuman strength, rapid breathing, not tiring despite heavy exertion, naked/inappropriate clothed, also medical condition apparently, sweating profusely, hot to the touch, and attraction to or destruction of glass specifically. And this comes from authors Gerostomulos in the Encyclopedia of Forensic Science, 2nd edition from 2013, and C.A. Hall in the Encyclopedia of Forensic and Legal Medicine, 2nd edition in 2016, respectively, for those two quotes. I inserted the sarcastic, these are medical condition parts of those quotes. They didn't say that.
Yes, they did not.
But it's just, to me, it's funny to like use as part of your description of a diagnosis destruction of glass, inappropriately clothed,
Right.
like not listening, failure to attend to police presence. That's just such a weird, not like highly specific thing
Right.
to call like part of a diagnosis.
Right. A fever, something that occurs across the entire species. Not responding to police officers, that's specifically a behavior. Come on, let's be real here.
Yeah.
So what you'll find is like many of the descriptions include superhuman strength, endurance, and generally psychotic behavior or abnormal behavior in that circumstance. To me, I'm reading these and I'm going, well, these could all be behaviors of somebody who is under the influence of something.
Yeah.
Sure, but I would be hard pressed to call that like a specific medical condition by itself. I'd look for something else.
Yeah, or diagnosable psychological condition.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, let's be fair. Want to give try and give a fair shake and get the opinions from the professionals, and the professionals in this case being advertisers. All right, we're back, and we have different professionals, different experts here. We're going to use what they say, and we're going to try and, I think, charitably include their descriptions of why they think excited delirium is a good thing to be used to describe these deaths that are occurring from people in police custody.
Yes. So in defense of the idea of excited delirium, critics attempt to explain how death results from delirium through other underlying causes and factors such as medical or psychological conditions or drugs eliciting overexcitement. And what they do is they question the idea that someone could even die from being restrained prone with someone kneeling on their back. So they've kind of created this defense that excited delirium exists, and they will say like these other causes aren't actually the reason this person died. It's this excited delirium thing.
And that, like, the fact that they're dying in police custody when they're being restrained in a prone position while someone kneels on their back is unrelated to the fact that that's just a thing that happened. And so they tried to show that by doing a few studies. And you might be asking, how do you do studies where you lean on someone's back to the point of them dying in a controlled way? They didn't. So in a series of group designs, researchers, doctors Theodore Chan and Gary Vilke, or Vilke maybe, took as many as 15 to 30 healthy young adults and placed them in prone position. Let me say that again. 15 to 30 healthy young adults who are presumably in pretty good shape. They placed them in a prone position, restrained them in some experiments, and with up to 50 pounds of pressure on their back in the initial studies, up to 225 pounds in later studies, and also in later studies, they asked them to, while they had that weight on their back, move around vigorously to sort of create the conditions of maybe a heightened level of pressure on their chest cavity while also exerting themselves against that restraint. And their hypothesis here being, of course, then that if they don't die from this, then they can't die from this.
Oh, God. Okay. So they reported statistically, but not clinically significant impairments to lung capacity and functionality. So they basically found that there was some impairment, but it wasn't that much in this space. That's what they reported, right?
Yeah, not enough to account for death.
Not enough to account for death.
Yeah.
Essentially, their conclusion was then that people cannot die of asphyxia from being kneeled upon their backs. And this is not true. We're going to talk about this later. And also, there's something called positional asphyxiation. Do you talk about that later?
Yeah.
Great. I can't wait to talk about that.
Yeah, we have a whole thing to talk about positional asphyxiation coming up here. So, not surprisingly, most of the academic support comes from researchers in disciplines that stand to face a pretty high level of scrutiny, and at this point, probably several instances of liability if excited delirium proves to not, in fact, be a potential cause of death.
Sure.
And so these people then, in these sort of academic circles, if you will, academic in heavy scare quotes, they instead downplay the extent to which death can be in any way attributed to the actions of police, and even give recommendations for how to restrain someone in the exact positions that they're likely to die of. I mean, die of excited delirium, but that they're likely to die of, which is wild to me. So here's some specific quotes of recommendations for giving restraint. And this comes from a 2005 entry in the Encyclopedia of Forensic and Legal Medicine by J.D. Howard.
Yes, so this is a direct quote. This is not a recommendation from us, by the way.
Yes, thank you.
Just to be really clear. Okay, so this is the quote. Because of the extreme agitation that is often associated with excited delirium, a person may have restraint devices applied to both the arms and the legs in order to be adequately controlled. Hobble restraint is used in reference to a variety of restraint techniques intended to limit a person's leg movements. Commonly, this refers specifically to the simultaneous use of handcuffs and leg restraints, a technique that is also called hog tying.
The quote goes on, the person putting the handcuffs and ankle bindings on the person being restrained often places a knee and weight on the back of the individual during the process, resulting in chest compression, end quote. So that is how they explain what to do in these situations.
Yes. Abraham did a really good job of finding a great picture of what this would look like.
Yeah.
Without the pressure on the back, but a very clear hog tying. It's basically your hands are behind your back and they're tied to your ankles behind your back. And so you're laying on your stomach with your hands and ankles tied together.
That's how they sort of describe it. So that is essentially how they're describing and recommending and defending the use of these types of techniques and why they think that they do not result in excited delirium. Probably more biased than I wanted to make it, but it's hard to write about these things without laughing at the ridiculousness of it all sometimes. But so let's look at the critics, though. I think it's worth still unpacking what they have to say about this, and specifically this idea of excited delirium as a contribution to the death of people in kind of any circumstance, but specifically in police custody.
Right. So one of the big arguments is that, and specifically critics that argue against these studies, what they do is they'll say, one, that the samples are too small.
Yeah.
15 to 30. Yeah, it's fair.
And a group design, yeah, that's very, very small.
That's very, very small. And second, that in one instance, there was no evidence that IRB approval was obtained, which calls into question whether the study itself was conducted with integrity, with the right safeguards in place. There's a lot to kind of unpack within the situation where there's not an IRB specifically overseeing those studies.
Yeah, very much so. They also argue that the studies include a non-representative sample of participants because they're using these sort of healthy, young, fit, sober adults that they measured with. And they also had a non-representative sample of conditions under which death occurs because they couldn't really simulate that. I mean, this is understandable here. The researchers could not create the actual condition that would result in participant death, right? For research, they can't do life-threatening, known life-threatening activity for the safety of the participants. And to be clear, the critics are not arguing that they should try and accomplish the scenario that simulates closely enough life-threatening conditions, because then people, again, would die unnecessarily. We don't want that to happen.
Right.
So they're kind of pointing out that it's nearly impossible to do good research on that question specifically.
Right. They also found that other aspects of their methodology were dubious at best, which dubious is such a great word.
Yeah.
I feel like whenever I say it, I have to say dubious. And that there are clear conflicts of interest and bias among the researchers and the research team. So that in itself is enough to be able to call into question at least even a healthy skepticism about these studies. When you're going into this and you're looking at this from a critical research lens, you have to know these things about the studies that are being published.
Very much so. Now, as we kind of alluded to this already, as we were giving the description of what excited delirium is, we said things just to sort of refresh your memory on this, but we said things like bizarre, aggressive behavior, unexpected physical strength, failing to respond to police presence, not tiring despite heavy exertion, inappropriate clothing. And I think astute listeners may have noticed at this point that these are sort of fuzzy, ambiguous definitions and criteria that are being used to describe this excited delirium. Now, surely there are clear medical or psychological symptoms and etiology that can be diagnosed that clearly show excited delirium.
Yeah. So if we had to ask, no. Excited delirium is not a medical or psychological condition recognized by any professional or medical association. The DSM has a definition for delirium more broadly, but explicitly states that delirium cannot be a cause of death. So there's already and we've got a lot to say about the DSM anyway, but at the very least, there is a widely accepted book that says, no, this is not a cause of death. The ICD also does not contain excited delirium as a referenceable cause of death. It is always diagnosed post-mortem, but always in cases of ambiguous or even vaguely, arguably ambiguous types of situations. It is a catch-all meant to give some cause when you don't have another one or you don't want another one. And I think that seems really convenient for a large department that wants to reduce their liability and they don't want to get in trouble. It sounds like this might be a really good way out.
Yeah. Now, there's an important part here that I think maybe the proponents of excited delirium like to point to, which is that there is a higher rate of mortality among people with mental health issues. And that in a lot of these situations where police are called and they have a death that is then later attributed to excited delirium, these are often people who are in the throes of a mental health crisis of some kind, such as we described at the beginning of this discussion in the case of Angelo Quinto, right?
Right.
And to a point, this is true because life expectancy is 10 to 20 years shorter among people with a mental health diagnosis or psychiatric patients compared to non-psychiatric patients or non-diagnosed adults of similar demographics.
Right.
Now, often, there are correlated medical conditions that increase the likelihood of mortality among people with mental health disorders. There are often physical diagnoses that also then have an impact on cognition, and therefore they receive a psychiatric or mental health disability. And those medical complications also are associated with a higher rate of mortality, meaning that those people with that mental health diagnosis also then have a higher rate of mortality. But what are the causes of death among the population of people, more generally speaking, who simply have a psychiatric diagnosis? Well, a 2018 study by Monasterio, I think is how you'd say that, and colleagues reported that the causes of death among people with mental health diagnoses were suicide, motor vehicle accidents and falls, medical causes, mostly cardiac arrest, and homicide, in that order. And with suicide making up over half of all of those deaths. So all the rest of them are fairly small percentages, where by the time you get to homicide, it's like 1%. You'll notice in there, I did not say that these were actually caused by a psychological condition itself. And there are actually not a lot of acute psychological conditions that do result directly in death.
That's a critical thing here, especially when you have coroners or medical examiners who are reporting that excited delirium is a cause of death, even in postmortem, that they're kind of diagnosing this, right? Because at the end of the day, it cannot be. The consistent factor in deaths attributed to excited delirium is the restraint itself. People are not dying suddenly of excited delirium when they are being restrained in a supine, which is, on your back facing up, or in an upright position, and without neck or chest compressions. The prone position restraint has been condemned by many organizations, including the U.S. National Institute of Health, and are frequently cited as unsafe and more likely to result in death.
Yes. This is where we really start to get into this positional asphyxia, as you were talking about. And so I think acknowledging that we're actually through sort of the bulk of the main part of excited delirium here. So this will definitely be a shorter episode. Let's take one more quick ad break. We might squeeze in one more at the end, but we're going to take another quick ad break, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about this positional asphyxia and some other things about the implications of excited delirium.
I love it.
Okay, so we're back. Let's talk more about some of the implications of excited delirium as it relates to professional organizations.
So, according to the Physicians for Human Rights organization, excited delirium syndrome, quote, has come to be used as a catch-all for deaths occurring in the context of law enforcement restraint, often coinciding with substance use or mental illness, and disproportionately used to explain the deaths of young black men in police encounters, end quote. So, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
Super important, though, to understand what our data are suggesting right now.
Right. And so this is something that we kind of haven't really alluded to yet, is the fact that it occurs at a much higher rate with people of color specifically. And another thing that people might be thinking about here is, well, if these are medical examiners and coroners who are making this diagnosis, then they're just receiving the body and then saying what they see. And they have as one of their things that they can call this excited delirium. So presumably they're using some level of objective criteria to do that. Well, not really. As we said, first of all, there aren't any objective criteria. They often have to, if they're going to use that, as we described in the definition of excited delirium, they kind of have to rely on some police report because they can't look at a body and say, were they failing to acknowledge police presence?
Right.
That's not going to be something that's immediately medically evident. And furthermore, what's important here is that a lot of these medical examiners and coroners exist as part of police departments. And there's been a really big call for trying to move medical examiners and coroners to independent third-party systems because a survey of members of the National Association of Medical Examiners found that 22% of the members reported feeling pressured by political or authority figures to change the manner of death that they listed on the cause of death certificate. And so in-house, there is a baked-in bias and the potential of pressure from authority figures to specifically call it excited delirium, even when they have already ruled it as something else.
It seems unrealistic to think that a police department might be corrupt in any way. So this is breaking news for me. I never would have thought that departments that really were really into the war on drugs could not imagine that they would want to pressure people into changing documents.
How could this happen?
How did we get here? Just police in my day. I can't even finish that sentence. Although the National Association of Medical Examiners, or NAME, has contained most or many of the people who have championed excited delirium as a cause of death, the more recent position statements from NAME say that excited delirium as a term is, quote, not endorsed by NAME or recognized in renewed classifications of the WHO, ICD-10, and DSM-5. Instead, NAME endorses the underlying cause, natural or unnatural, to include trauma, or for the delirious state be determined, if possible, and used for death certification, end quote. So basically what they're saying is they're not going to use excited delirium anymore as an organization.
Yeah, they don't recognize that would be a cause of death, that they recommend that they look for other conditions that would more readily attribute to cause of death. And although they didn't say this in their position statement, that's going to be asphyxia in almost all of them.
Yes, 100%.
Now, if you think about all of the interactions that might happen with police, no matter what side of the spectrum you are on here, in terms of like really for the use of police tactics or really against them, anywhere in between, there are many, many reasons a person might die in police custody, right? So you would think that any one reason would actually make up a relatively small proportion because there's so many options.
Right.
Like even if one of them was more than another, you'd be like, well, there's like 1,000 ways that someone might die that would be even unrelated to something that police did, directly. Not to mention the 1,000 ways that they might die by something that police did do directly.
Right.
And so if you have that many reasons, then there's not going to be any one of them that ever makes up more than like 1% of the reasons. Yet there is this one cause of death that kind of rises to the top as one of the most common reasons people die in police custody. In fact, here's some numbers about that very thing.
Yeah, real data. More than 16% of deaths that occurred in police custody in Texas from 2005 to 2017 were reported as due to excited delirium. 16% of those deaths.
Yes. That's a very large percentage for, again, the thousands of ways that someone might die.
Right.
62% of deaths due to excited delirium that occurred in Florida were people in police custody from 2010 to 2022.
This state, I it's just like I can't get away from it. Like every time. I'm just like, it's that thing where like you're disappointed in somebody, you don't think they could go any lower, and they just keep doing it. Like Florida is that thing for me. It's like, God, you're beautiful, but what's wrong with you?
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Yeah. It is a beautiful state.
It is beautiful. It's beautiful. There's a lot to see here, but good Lord.
Yeah.
Can we just get something right?
The government there is a mess.
It's a mess. 56% of deaths due to excited delirium in police custody were Black and Latinx folks. So
56%.
56%.
That is so high. I mean, the percent of the population that is represented by Black and Latinx folks is so much less that like they are not 56% of the population. They're not even 56% of people who are arrested by police. And yet they represent the majority of deaths due to excited delirium in police. That by itself is an extremely alarming statistic in my mind.
That's a red flag. You should see that and go, oh, that's a problem.
Yes.
There might be something wrong there.
Yes. So here's the important thing. So the simple solution here is to stop restraining people by placing them in a prone position with weight on their back or neck, and really honestly in a prone position at all. In fact, let's stop all three of those things separately. No prone restraints, no weights or pressure on the neck, no weights or pressure on the back. So let's actually talk for a second about positional asphyxia.
So, if you're not familiar with this term positional asphyxia, it just means that your airway is restricted because of a position that you're in.
Yes.
So, for example, if you've ever laid down a certain way or laid in a certain position and it was very difficult to breathe, that's an example of how positional asphyxiation can lead into cause of death. As somebody who's a restraint trainer, one of the things that we are taught, and whenever we do a prone positioning for somebody who might be in a restraint during a crisis management circumstance, we are told explicitly to not put any pressure on the trunk or the torso of the person.
Yeah.
Like, you're not supposed to be touching their neck. You're not supposed to be putting your hands or your knees or any part of your body on their back or their chest or anything like that.
And to be clear, you didn't put them in a prone position. They happen to be in a prone position in this condition, right?
Yes. Yeah. Now, and further, to add to this, there are some medical conditions that in a prone position increases the risk of death. So, like, if I am overweight, a significant degree, if I have breathing airway issues, a lot of times what they'll say is, like, if you have somebody who has Down syndrome, they should not be put in a prone position because they are an asphyxiation risk.
Yeah.
Just based on, like, the structures of their mouth and tongue and in their breathing airways. And so positional asphyxiation is just that. I am put in a position that I cannot breathe and my airways are restricted. Now, does this sound familiar when we're talking about somebody being on their stomach with somebody pressing on their chest cavity or their back? They're pressing on this part of your body that is supposed to expand to gather breath.
Yeah, exactly. And just as you were saying, we're trained that, I mean, even in someone who's supine. So we've been talking about prone position, meaning face down. Even if they're supine, which means they're face up, we're still trained. You do not put pressure on on any place on their torso. You can block arm movements, you can block leg movements, but you do not put pressure because there's just the additional risk of any kind of medical emergency that might come from squishing people's organs, like their lungs, their heart, their stomach, their intestines, anything like that. Don't do it. And this is many governments and medical organizations and medical government like affiliations have come out and basically said, don't use prone restraint. Don't put someone in prone positions. Like, people will arrive in prone positions. They tripped and fell. They threw themselves down. There might be many reasons that they end up prone, but you do not put someone in a prone position. If you can get them into a supine position safely, then you can do that.
Right.
If you need to restrain them in an upright or supine position. But no matter what, don't put compression on their chest or airways because that can kill them. And that's just something that we know. So you don't do it.
Right. So police are even generally aware of this, although it seems that within this kind of space and within the space of excited delirium, many of them see excited delirium as a kind of mystical, spurious cause of death to avoid feeling responsible, I would imagine. So, for example, while Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on George Floyd's neck, one of his fellow officers, Thomas Lane, suggested, quote, roll him on his side? I just worry about the excited delirium or whatever, end quote. Like, that actually came up in George Floyd's case.
Yeah, he might accidentally die from a thing that's not your fault because you're kneeling on his neck.
Yeah.
That's essentially what he's saying, right?
Yeah. In that space, if you were to pick that apart, if it were excited delirium and that were a real thing, it wouldn't matter what position he was in. He would end up dying from the excited delirium.
Right. Exactly.
So rolling him over wouldn't have changed that. But suggesting to roll him over suggests that, we know it's not a real thing. We know that you're probably going to cause a problem.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I think suffice it to say, I would probably have more to say, but prone restraints and chest or neck compressions are completely unnecessary to ever sufficiently restrain someone. There are other less risky restraints that can always be used to successfully subdue aggressive behavior that do not depend on putting someone in a prone restraint.
Right.
I think we just need to outright say no more prone restraints. That will solve so many of these problems. Like, so many of them. Mm-hmm. So, like, let's just do that because we can successfully, easily restrain people without putting their lives at risk by virtue of just having them in an inappropriate position or applying undue compression to their breathing and airways.
Right. It's also worth taking a moment to evaluate what circumstances led me to a point where I need to restrain somebody. Like, how did I get to this place where I would need to even do that? If it's something that you can avoid in the future, that's the best way to go. Like, it's best to set up a circumstance so you don't need to restrain somebody.
Yeah.
There's so many things that can lead up to it. And I'm not going to go out there and say that, like, no restraint ever is the thing.
Yes.
Because I've been in situations where I've used my hostage negotiation tactics and all the things that come up that like to kind of prevent and de-escalate. Sometimes it doesn't work, but I can count on one hand how many times I've ever had to use a prone positioning for a restraint, and that was, 10 years ago. So I've been able to move away from that. So
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth just stopping and saying, and kind of like maybe summing all this up, right? What is excited delirium? It's nothing. It's made up.
Yeah.
It's something that some police departments pressure coroners to put on paperwork is what it is. It's not a real psychological event as far as the psychological and medical fields are concerned. It is a description applied to situations in which someone died at the hands of someone else, and that someone else wants to escape culpability by saying it was something that just happened. And specifically, it is used to target people of color in these spaces.
Yeah.
From the get-go, it was established to be a thing that happened to people of color only, and that is how it has turned into something that is used so much today.
Yes. So that's kind of it. Like this whole idea of excited delirium, it adds up to a big old nothing burger in terms of it, what it actually is. I think how it's used is potentially the more interesting thing here. And understanding it is, on the one hand, I kind of want to be sensitive to the fact that I want to almost celebrate that police feel bad enough about killing someone on accident that they want to take the responsibility off of themselves. It makes me happy to think that they care that they killed somebody and that they feel bad about that.
Right.
I mean, just that like they don't have that as a value, that like murder is not something they actively seek to do. I mean, obviously many of them do, but in many of these cases, they're like trying to absolve, and maybe it's just legal culpability. Maybe that's the only thing. But I would like to choose to believe that like there's some amount of like, I don't want to be responsible for another human's death, that might enter into at least some of their consciousness as they're in the situation, that they would like to invoke this so that they don't have that weighing on them. Now, I think that is being, in my mind, extremely generous to the vast majority of people for whom this has been the case. And I don't want to be accused of sort of trying to, take a specific side of the people who are the perpetrators of the case, where there are people who are being victimized by the brutality of these authority figures. But what I am trying to do is take the nuanced position of, is there silver lining here at all? And the silver lining, if I can see any, is that there might be the desire to not kill people, and that then they feel like that's how they try and get that off of their mind. And that just makes me feel better that they don't want to kill people, but I am speculating wildly at this point.
Yeah.
Again, being way nicer than I need to be.
Yeah. Because it's still a thing that happens, and it's still terrible.
Yeah. So a couple other quick interesting things. I thought just that there's a lot of names for this. So if the whole time you've been hearing excited delirium and being like, I don't know what that means, but I have heard of Bell's mania. Well, in that case, same thing. There's also psychosis with exhaustion. This is actually tricky because I heard this in a separate discussion on a podcast, and I could find no references to anybody calling it that, even looking over the timeline of it. So I'm not sure where that one came from, but I did hear it used, so I thought I'd at least mention it here. I also saw as terms that people might use to describe this agitated delirium, restraint asphyxia, and as we noted before, positional asphyxia. So some of the fun things there. Not fun, but
Yeah, and which, agitated delirium and restraint asphyxia are two very different things, right? Like when you really understand, when you look at the etiology of, or like the etymology of that, right? Like when you look at kind of what like these come from, agitated delirium is suggestive of a psychological disorder, where restraint asphyxia is very clearly a circumstantial thing.
Okay, well, I think we actually did make it to another ad break. So we are going to say our thank yous. We're going to acknowledge our team. We're going to give you, if you're joining us for the first time, you may not know this, but we actually like to end with what I think is one of the more fun segments of every piece that we do, which is we give some recommendations for things that we have enjoyed recently. So that if you want to, you can go check them out. You don't have to, of course. We'll let the advertisers do their thing and then come back with our sort of wrap up here. Okay, as I always like to end on, I'll try and keep this relatively brief because I spend a lot of time on this every episode, and I know that people who have been with us for a long time have heard this just many, many, many times. You can support us by picking up merch on our website, and you can join us on Patreon where you get access to extra perks and benefits. The people who have already done that, what we appreciate so much, includes Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, and Brian. Thank you all for your awesome support. You are the best. If you join us, you get a shout out just like they did.
Yeah.
You can also support us by leaving us a rating and review, subscribe, tell a friend, do all that sort of stuff. Thank you so much to my team for their help. Shane and myself do a lot of writing and fact checking, and all of our editing and production and sound comes from Justin Greenhouse, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. This is a group of people I could not do without. Now, without further ado, do we have anything before we get to our recommendations?
I don't think so. I think we can just jump right in.
Let's recommend some things.
All right.
Recommendations.
So, at the time of this recording, it's been a couple Fridays since there was this one very special Friday where all this really new music, like really good new music came out. And it was like album after album after album. And I've been like kind of spending a lot of time with those albums from that day. And the one album that I gotta say I've been a big fan of is Chambers, A Love to Kill For.
Okay.
If you have not heard Chamber, I'm going to go ahead and say if you are somebody who is trying to find that Dillinger Escape Plan kind of analog,
yeah,
this is a good place to go. My friend described it as this. He was making lasagna, and the lasagna came out, like while he was listening to this, he was making lasagna, listening to this, and the lasagna came out tasting like a fight.
Listening to Chamber, A Love to Kill For?
Yeah, listen to Chamber, Love to Kill For.
Wow.
It's very like chaotic. The drummer is really incredible. I mean, when you listen to it, you're like, this is wild. It's very angry. So if you don't like stuff like this, then, go listen to Suicide Machines like we talked about earlier and have some fun for our patron bonuses. But it's definitely a good listen if you like that type of like kind of heavy, chaotic kind of like if you're a fan of Knocked Loose, if you're somebody who knows who Knocked Loose is listening to this, then you might like this because it's a little bit more interesting, I think.
All right, fair enough. Well, I love Dillinger Escape Plan, so you very much have piqued my interest.
I think you'll like this band a lot.
That's awesome. I dig that. I should have this as my recommendation because I just recently went through the Dillinger Escape Plan's entire discography again, and
so just good.
So much fun. Really good stuff. But I'll maybe save that for another day. Just consider that as a bonus off the cuff. I said a thing that you might like.
Yeah.
But my actual recommendation is a movie that came out somewhat recently on Netflix called The Outlaws. This is a very silly action adventure comedy sort of thing that I don't want to spoil too much about, but suffice it to say it's about two people who are getting married, and the groom meets the bride's parents, who are very eccentric people, and a wacky adventure ensues.
Nice.
And so I think that it's supposed to be a pun on the in-laws instead, called The Outlaws. It's a fun time if you're into like a sort of turn your mind off and just watch a silly, funny action adventure movie. Not terribly long. It's got Pierce Brosnan in it, a lot of other notable actors, but just a fun movie.
I love that. I like movies that are just fun. Like you don't have to like overthink it,
Yes, this is not an overthink it type movie, but has some good comedy beats in it. So
good.
All right. If you have something to say about Excited Delirium and like to tell us how great of a job that we did, you should reach out to us directly. You can reach us on social media. You can email us directly at info@wwdpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from each and every one of you and all that you have to say. And as I said, consider joining us on Patreon to help support what we're doing in this show. Is there anything that I missed or anything you would like to add before we wrap up today, Shane?
No, I think that covers it.
Perfect. This is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.